Hey everybody, this is Marianne Nice. I'm a speech and language pathologist and reading specialist. Thanks for coming to one of my seminars. I'm happy to share with you this 15-minute, maybe 18-minute crash course in dyslexia. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues. If you're looking for something more in-depth, check out my website, realityed.com. There is a 40-minute webinar on dyslexia there as well. Take care. Thanks for joining me on this 15-minute crash course in Dyslexia Basics. Since we don't have a lot of time, we'll get right into our content. What you're looking at now is a theoretical model depicting the simple view of reading, also represented by Scarborough's reading rope. So this was conceptualized by Hollis Scarborough in 2001. And I love this graphic because it really depicts a number of both cognitive and linguistic skills, abilities that are required for a student to become an accurate, fluent reader who can comprehend what they read. What you're seeing here are two major strands that are weaving together over time. The lower strand being word recognition. So these are all of the abilities that are involved in being able to decode and to spell. So you see here phonological awareness, actual decoding and spelling of words, and sight word recognition. So in order to become a fluent reader, students need to be proficient with phonics and recognize words with automaticity. On the top strand, you're seeing what's involved with comprehension of text, both language knowledge, background knowledge, verbal reasoning, strategy knowledge. All of those components are very important for a reader to grab meaning from the page. So we have these two pieces that weave together over time, and it takes many years for students to become a strong reader. When it comes to dyslexia, we're talking about a type of learning disability which has its roots in word recognition. So dyslexic students may have great language comprehension when they're not decoding text. So they can listen and comprehend oral language well. They may have average or better than average cognitive abilities, background knowledge. So what's unusual for a dyslexic student is this problem they have with word recognition, and typically rooted in phonological processing and difficulties obtaining phonics skills. Let's look at just a couple of myths and facts that surround dyslexia. Regarding the origins and the characteristics of dyslexia, the number one myth you are going to hear out there is that this is a visual disorder and that dyslexic students see letters and numbers backwards. That is a big myth. You're going to see that dyslexia is actually rooted in language, and it's more of a language-related disorder than it is a visual disorder. Other things you'll hear about dyslexia, people will assume that when students have trouble learning to read, it must mean because they are struggling because they don't have the same level of intelligence or average intelligence. That's untrue as well. Word recognition and intelligence are not related. So you can be a very intelligent person and still struggle with learning how to decode or struggle with word recognition, which is exactly what dyslexia is. Other myths out there is that you can't diagnose this condition, dyslexia, until a child's much older and they've had a lot of opportunities to learn how to read. The science has come a long way in this area, and there are screeners that can determine who is at risk at very early ages, and we can even diagnose this problem at very early ages. Regarding the treatment of dyslexia, couple of more myths. The idea that if folks believe that this is a visual disorder, therefore vision therapy might help the student. Again, this is not rooted in vision. This is rooted in language. And vision therapy typically is not recommended for students unless they're students that have eye convergence issues. So conditions of eye convergence are the only conditions under which vision therapy is recommended for students. Otherwise, most of the treatments for dyslexia have little to do with any type of visual training. All right, other types of myths. that if a dyslexic student can't decode, we should try to teach them other types of strategies to access print. Good readers use lots of different strategies, but we don't want to bypass any skill development just because a student presents with dyslexia. What we need to do is instruct them in a different way. Oh, this one is a heartbreaker for me. Folks believe that if it's too late to teach students if they're older, so students that are in middle school, high school, they've missed their opportunity and they can't learn to read. That's not true. There's folks in prisons, there's adults that are learning to read at later ages. We can teach students how to become accurate readers. What we may not be able to do is catch students up in their rate of reading or their fluency of reading, but we can teach students to be accurate readers. All right, let's take a look at the definition of dyslexia as it's described by the International Dyslexia Association. There's a few pieces I've underlined. I'm not going to read it word for word, but I'll summarize it for you in this way. Dyslexia, yes, it is a specific type of learning disability, and it's neurobiological in origin, which means that students that have dyslexia are born with differences in their brain structure. And the characteristics of dyslexia are exactly what you may have observed in your lifetime. These students or adults struggle with accurate or fluent word recognition. Also, they have trouble spelling and trouble learning how to decode words. These difficulties, this is the most interesting part of the definition. It says it typically results in the phonological component of language. So what's interesting about the definition is that it does name the smoking gun, the major contributor to this deficit, and then we'll get into what that is in a few minutes. Also, that it's unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So dyslexic students, as I mentioned earlier, often can comprehend language that they're listening to very well compared to what they can do when they're trying to decode. Also, something to consider is the type of instruction that a student has had as well. And then it goes on to mention secondary consequences as a result of having dyslexia. Well, how do we know that dyslexia is neurobiological? Well, prior to the use of functional MRIs, we did not know quite how neurobiological dyslexia was. There were a number of theories out there, but it's really the research that has occurred from the 90s into the 2000s with functional MRI studies that have shown differences in brain structures of students that have dyslexia. So really, the only true way to definitively diagnose dyslexia would be with a functional MRI, but we do have educational assessments that can evaluate both quantitatively and qualitatively the characteristics of dyslexia, and will give us an idea as to who's experiencing this and who is not. We're not at the point yet where we have functional MRI studies that could be done, or an MRI that you could go and have at your doctor's office where we could diagnose dyslexia. So kids aren't going to their pediatrician to have this diagnosed. So it is an educational issue that can be diagnosed in educational settings, including a school system. We don't have time to go into that with this crash course, but if you're interested in learning about that, I cover that in another webinar. So their kids aren't going to their pediatrician or seeing a neurologist at this point, but perhaps down the road that will occur. Is there a gene? Is this genetic? Yes, it's genetic. It's believed to be polygenetic, meaning there isn't a single gene. What's also tricky here is that the dyslexia, the way it presents itself, is influenced by a number of other factors, both environmental and educational. So students may have a genetic predisposition to dyslexia, but their environment, their education may have influences on whether or not their dyslexia becomes a mild, a moderate, or a severe impairment for them in their education. What's challenging with reading, and this will dovetail with what we've been talking about with dyslexia. What's challenging is that reading takes place in different parts of the brain. So you'll notice as you're looking here at this diagram that we have a spot in the brain that is specific to hearing, specific to vision, specific to speech production, even specific to smell. But there isn't one spot in the brain that is specific to reading. So reading requires an interaction between multiple parts of the brain. This four-part processing model is simplistic, but a great depiction of what's happening in the brain as the reader takes in text. Every circle you're seeing here represents a different part of the brain. And the interactions begin between the phonological processor and the orthographic processor. Those interactions bounce to the meaning processor and the context processor. You're noticing that the arrows don't just point unidirectionally, but bidirectionally, meaning that these parts of the brain are constantly communicating with each other. So what we know, not just from functional MRI studies, but also eye movement studies and other longitudinal studies, we know for certain that readers do process from the bottom up. So they are linking the visual image of the letter. So is that a letter B or is it a letter D? And then once they can visually distinguish between the two, they're linking that to that speech sound. So the orthographic processor and the phonological processor are interacting. And so that is that sound and symbol connection. We know that that's very important. And for many students, this is the earliest sign that they are going to struggle with reading and they could be dyslexic. You may have screeners in place at your facility that examine different parts of this four-part processing model. So if you're thinking back to what we mentioned earlier with the reading rope, we have those essentials for word recognition, and then we have that upper strand, essentials for comprehension of text. Think of those two orange circles of this four-part processor as being the pieces that are important for those word recognition essentials, or the lower part of the rope or lower order skills. And think of the green and the blue sections, the meaning and the context processor, to be essential for the comprehension of text, so the upper part of the rope or the higher order skills. Again, all of these pieces interact, but it's important that we understand which pieces we may need to target more if the student is showing deficits in those areas. And that's why, as I mentioned, those early screeners will be looking for things that the student may struggle with as early as kindergarten in those orange circles. Oftentimes, those are in the form of phonemic awareness assessments and letter naming assessments. So, as far as interventions, what works for dyslexic students? Well, as I mentioned earlier, dyslexia occurs on a spectrum. So some students with dyslexia may present with more mild forms and others more severe forms. The most important thing we do isn't to try to find all of the students and get them on an IEP and identify them as dyslexic. The most important thing we can do as educators is put screeners in place as early as possible and look for students that have any sort of risk factors. If they have risk factors, then we need to treat them as if they could be dyslexic and hopefully minimize the impact on their education. But much like in this spectrum disorder, there's outside influences, attention being one of them. ADHD and dyslexia, those are comorbid and they occur between 30 and 40% of the time with each other. So students that have attention deficit disorder also have an increased risk of having dyslexia. Other pieces that interplay here are cognitive abilities, language, background knowledge, environment, instructional experiences as well. So there's quite a bit that can influence how significant the disability is for students. So again, if we know the roots of dyslexia occur at the word recognition level, then our interventions really need to tackle those areas. One thing, another myth that you can dispel for sure is that there's many folks out there that believe it's just not worth it to teach the rules of our language. That is so incorrect. Our language has structure and it has organization. 80 to 84% of the language is predictable when following the rules, if the rules are taught. So students with dyslexia are going to respond very well to instruction that teaches them about the structural organization of English. Now, why this again, would be a little bit of a different webinar, and we'd go a little bit deeper into this, but we know our language is morphophonemic, and we know that when students are struggling with word recognition, they really benefit from instruction that teaches them about the organization of language, from letter sound correspondences, so sounds and symbols, to syllable types, and then to larger, more meaningful chunks or morphemes, Greek, Latin roots, combining forms, prefixes, suffixes, and the like. So what type of methods work well for students with dyslexia? Well, Orton-Gillingham methods, you may have heard this before. These structured literacy approaches are best suited for students with dyslexia. It really is known as the gold standard in literacy approaches. It's important to remember that Orton-Gillingham is a methodology, it's an approach. It is not a program in and of itself, but there's a value system here, and that's with very systematic, sequential, cumulative, meaning it's spiraling forward, and this instruction is very much around the organization of our language, as I mentioned before. So sounds and symbols, syllable types, and morphemes. One of the big myths out there is that Orton-Gillingham based approaches, or Orton-Gillingham in general, is a one-size-fits-all approach. It's actually so far from that. It is not a one-size-fits-all, but the method does work with students. So there's many commercial programs aligned with this approach that offer all kinds of very unique and multisensory opportunities for students. And some programs are better matches for some students than others. I have a couple of programs here listed that are aligned with Orton-Gillingham's methodology, but they're all very different and they teach things in a different order, but they do get back to those essential values of explicit and systematic instruction in the structure of our language. So we're going to wrap this up. I hope this gave you just a little bit of an overview about dyslexia. Where can you go for more information? My favorite website, the best place to go for more information is the International Dyslexia Association's website. That's dyslexiaida.org. Or if you're interested in joining me, I have another 40-minute webinar that will cover this information and a little bit more in further depth. So I look forward to that if anybody is interested in joining me on that. Here's how folks can get in touch with me, Marianne Nice at realityed.com, or just visit Reality Ed and just go to the section on training and you will see some sections on dyslexia. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for everything you do for students. Please spread the word about dyslexia and dispel some of those myths. Take care.